movement in the 1980s. Remember that a key feature of the social democratic system had been the pledge to full employment. Even by 1979, when Mrs. Thatcher comes to power, there's, unemployment had risen to about 1.5 million. But it rises very, very quickly after that and peaks in 1983 here at almost 3.5 million. In this context of scarce forms of employment, Mrs. Thatcher introduces arguably one of the most important measures, which was the Two Employment Acts of 1980 and 1982, designed to massively curb the power of the trade union movement, which you'll remember had been so contentious in the politics of the 1970s. The final battle with the trade union movement, though, really came in 1984. The 1982 Employment Act had outlawed the closed shop, which was basically where if you were employed in a particular factory that had a closed shop, you had to join the union. Okay? And it also required a ballot for the election of union officials, for strike action, and for the use of political funds, rather than by the traditional show of hands. So it was the introduction of a secret ballot. In 1984, the National Union of Miners wanted to hold a strike to protest against the rationalization policies brought in by a new American manager that Mrs. Thatcher had brought in of the mining industry. But very stupidly, politically, they didn't hold a ballot, and a closed ballot, and they went on strike. So the strike lasted for about 9 months. It was hugely contentious. It led to very dramatic scenes of conflict between the police and striking miners. Miners were out for 9 months, basically, on union strike pay, and Mrs. Thatcher basically beat the NUM, something that no government had done since the general strike of 1926. The consequence of this was that basically the will and the political force of the trade union movement was massively curtailed. And you can see that even though 1979 was the peak year of trade union membership of 13.5 million, by 1998 it had fallen in half to 6.7 million. The National Union of Miners fell from 200,000 members in 1980 to just 20,000 members in 1994, and the mining industry in Britain is now has effectively vanished. The other element of this reform of the labour market was to try and re-signify unemployment, not as a structural problem, but as one of the failure of individuals to find work. The individuals themselves were to blame because they lacked the key skills, or they weren't willing to do the new types of jobs that were becoming available. And it was in this set of attitudes that there are a whole series of measures designed to basically retool the labour market. A growing emphasis, for instance, in higher and further education in lifelong learning, that people should return to college to learn new skills, but also the association of the receipt of welfare benefits with retraining and retooling. And I'm just going to play you a clip of one of my favourite comedy shows set in an unemployment office where people are being trained to find work. Okay, I haven't got time to show you the rest of that much. It's a program called The League of Gentlemen, if you want to follow up. It's a fantastic series. Taxation reform was another key area here. Of course, the key element about taxation reform was the attempt to shrink the state, to make what we now think of as small government by reducing the size of government of public revenue and therefore the forms of public investment that were possible. But of course, one of the key features of the restructuring of the tax system was the increase in economic inequality. So 1979 to 1988, which was when Mrs. Thatcher's government first began to reform the tax system, they reduced the basic rate of tax from 33% to 25%, but more importantly and more symbolically, the top rate of tax, which had led people like Elton John to flee to the US to a happier tax system, from 83% to 40%, and cut the corporate rate of tax in half from 52 to 27%. It wasn't that tax revenue entirely diminished because, of course, government expenditure continued to be actually growing because of the scale of unemployment in the 1980s. So what happened instead was the emphasis was placed on sales tax, what in Britain is called value-added tax, which went up from 8 to 15% between 1979 and 1988. In many ways, the new Labour governments continued this policy, although they tried to create a lower rate of income tax for lower earners. So the bottom rate of tax went to 10%, the basic rate stayed at 20%, and the top rate at 40 or even 50%. But they also increased sales tax to 7.5% and introduced new forms of tax credit for working families and married people. One of the key features of Britain in the 1980s and the 1990s was the growing cluster of wealth in the South and in the South. So here you see the cluster of high-earning people down in the southeast in the London, and here you see the cluster of people on low incomes in the old manufacturing areas, basically where the industries had become slowly gutted. The other feature of these economic policies was the attempt to introduce new market principles to public services, effectively to restructure the public services system. And one of the key, this is a word I'm overusing today, an important way in which Mrs. Thatcher made this restructuring of public services popular was to criticise the dominance of welfare professionals and technocrats. So remember how I talked about how social democracy had been a revolution for the people but not by the people, and how it created this new intellectual aristocracy or technocracy that had presided over the operation of the welfare state. It was precisely these group of people who Mrs. Thatcher said not only created a dependency culture but didn't allow individuals to make their own choices that she sought to criticise. For her, public sector workers, people especially like doctors and teachers and even police, the police force, had occupied a too privileged position and have been allowed monopolies of power over the conduct of their areas. And it was these that she wanted to break down. Broadcasting would be another good example. So what she did was to try and make markets out of public services. So it wasn't just a question of privatising formerly nationalised industries, it was also a question of creating new market systems within public services, either by introducing private providers, like for instance private security companies conveying prisoners from trial to prison or providing prison workers, or by introducing the so-called audit culture, where for instance universities and schools and hospitals were ranked and rated in terms of their delivery of services so that the consumers could make more effective choices about which school or hospital they thought provided the better services, or by the introduction of internal market systems, and the National Health Service becomes the most famous example of that, where they try and introduce an internal market system. All of these policies were followed and indeed accelerated by Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher's successors, John Major, who introduced the Citizens' Charter in 1991 to lay out the levels of services that the public services should be providing. The key area of financialisation in this process was, of course, the shift to debt financing, and the use of debt financing both by the state and by individuals. So one of the key initiatives was the Private Finance Initiative that was first introduced in 1992 to use private funds for the development of public infrastructures. But this was a policy that Tony Blair basically made his own. So the enormous investment in schools and hospitals that the Blair administrations made after 1997 wasn't funded directly by the public revenue, but by private funds that the government was then paying off over many, many decades. So the Private Finance Initiative was basically about using new financial instruments to leverage capital to invest in infrastructure that then future generations would be paying off. It wasn't a debt that the government had to manage. And of course, the greatest everyday example of exactly the same system was the introduction of the student loan system, and exactly the same principle. In 1985, when I was at university, they abolished the minimum grant. Remember that higher education in Britain through to the early 90s, there were no tuition fees, and everybody until 1985 got a minimal grant from the state to pay for their maintenance. But 1985 was the beginning of the erosion of that process. A system of loans and fees was introduced by Tony Blair in 1997, when fees were introduced at a nominal £1,000 for each year. That was increased to £3,000 in 2004 and £9,000 in 2010, and along the way all forms of grant maintenance were lost, and a new government-operated student loan company came in to allow individuals to borrow money for their higher education. Okay, I'm on track, I think. So you can see the way in which these three levels that I've been trying to talk to you about are all enmeshed in each other: privatisation, financialisation, and marketisation. All three of them are used differently to restructure the British economy. Now what I wanted to talk about is the restructuring of the state, and whether indeed there was yet another revolution in government in the late 20th century. As I said at the beginning, one of the key features of neoliberalism in Britain was that these new market conditions and cultures were created by the state. The state introduces market systems even in what's left of the public services like schools and hospitals and the police force, etc., etc. And the idea was that rather like failed liberal individuals in the 19th century, the state needed to take a firm hand in order to make markets free. That is to say that you couldn't get a free market without a good deal of state intervention. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is that the very idea of a free market is itself a sort of anathema. That there's no such thing as a free market. That all markets are in certain important ways engineered, and in Britain, the key form of engineering is done by the state. Okay, so in many ways, the state takes as active a role in the creation of markets after the 1980s and the 1990s as the state did in terms of the delivery of welfare capitalism in the decades preceding it. The key thing about the state that Mrs. Thatcher and her successors wanted to do was to get rid of the idea of the nanny state that they argued had created this dependency culture. A dependency culture where people thought that they needed to rely upon the so-called nanny of the state to look after them. But also, critically, and here comes an important difference between the Thatcher administrations and the Blair administrations, an attempt to try and introduce a new type of moral government. Okay? So we're going to see an important difference here developing between Blair and Thatcher. So up to this point, I've basically been saying, look, Blair and Thatcher, the Conservative governments and the new Labour governments have effectively the same economic policies. Much is in the same way, frankly, that Clinton and Reagan followed similar types of economic policies. Okay, but the key difference was in terms of the social policies, and that the state continued to be involved in. So let me talk first about the political culture that delivered all of this. One important similarity between Blair and Thatcher was their embrace of what many people thought was a quite un-British presidential style of leadership. Remember that, unlike the presidential system here, Britain had a system of general elections where the Prime Minister was elected as the leader of the party that got elected, i.e. you don't vote for someone to become the Prime Minister. You vote for a party to be returned, and the leader of that party becomes the Prime Minister. But the power of party leaders and of prime ministers grows exponentially in the 80s and the 1980s. And both Thatcher and Blair present themselves as strong leaders and develop this new type of presidential style. So Thatcher did it infamously by presenting herself not as a consensus politician, but as a conviction politician. And this is how she got her reputation as the so-called Iron Lady, the woman who was not prepared to negotiate or to have a change in policy direction. She would stick to her principles regardless. This lady's not for turning, as she famously said at one party conference speech. How she got this reputation was by confronting a series of enemies that were described as the enemies within. She described them as the enemies within trying to thwart the project of economic liberalisation. So the first were the stakeholders of the nationalised industries that were described as lame ducks that needed to be reformed to be saved. The next came the hunger strikers of the IRA in 1981. Then the Argentinians in the conflict over the Falkland Islands, and the paternalist, the old paternalist guard of the Conservative Party that she described as WETS, and then the miners' strike, and then finally the project of European integration at the end of the 1980s. What she did was to promote this style of leadership that said, look, the more unpopular that I become, the more effective my leadership is. Because it's showing that I have these strong convictions and I have a vision of leadership. I'm not simply going to follow public opinion, I'm going to direct it. And Blair takes this on himself as a key element of his leadership style. As I said, the first thing that he does to define himself as apart from his party and leading his party, the personal qualities of these people, but the fact that their personal qualities become increasingly prominent in discussions about who should get elected and who would be the next Prime Minister. Here too is a key difference between Thatcher and Blair, though, which is their different approach to the central powers of the state. Mrs. Thatcher, even though she talked about rolling back the power of the state, actually presided over a massive centralisation of state power, and that was in large part because she was deeply hostile to local government. Right? Remember how important local government had been in Britain since the 19th century. Okay? Now, the problem was that local government in the 1980s, particularly in the big urban conurbations like Liverpool and Sheffield and Manchester, had radically left socialist local councils, pursuing policies that were diametrically opposed to the Thatcher agenda. They were sort of islands of socialism, and she wanted to reduce their room for manoeuvre. So between 1979 and 1990, there were no less than 50 separate legislative acts to reduce the power of local government, mainly by reducing their ability to charge local taxation and by reducing the size of their the grant that they got in aid from central government. Another key feature that, so I'm going to do this I'm just going to switch points here. Blair takes a pretty much opposite approach, which is to say that one of the key elements of his policies that he promoted in opposition was that he wanted to decentralise the state. And at the head of this policy was that of devolution, the idea that Northern Ireland, that Scotland and Wales would have their own assemblies or parliament. So in 1997, Wales and Ireland gets its own, Scotland gets its own parliament, and in 2000, the Mayor of London is created, the position of Mayor of London, because there's been no government of London since the abolition of the Greater London Council in 1986. So that's an important difference between Thatcher and Blair. A similarity was the growth of special advisors. Again, remember how important the idea of an independent civil service had been to the development of the British state in the 19th century. What you see from the 1980s, particularly, is the growth of a much more American style, where you have special advisors appointed by the governing party to within government departments, so that the official civil service was now working alongside a growing court of special advisors. So in 1974, Edward Heath had just 70 special advisors in his government, and by 1997, Tony Blair had over 200 special advisors dotted around Whitehall. I don't have time to get into the reform of the House of Lords. Almost there. A couple more slides. In some ways, central state in the 80s and 90s was the growth of the prison population. The emphasis upon law and order and being very tough on crime was a key rhetorical component of the Thatcher administration's attempt to make individuals responsible for their own actions again. Okay? But in fact, it's under Tony Blair that the prison population almost doubles in Britain. And again, here, the parallel to the United States and to California is very marked. Between 1993 and 2007, the prison population in Britain almost doubles. And Blair indeed comes in with a mantra that he was going to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. And that is to say, he tried to acknowledge the fact that there were social causes for criminal behaviour, but actually it was the prosecution of criminals that became centre stage during his administration. But it wasn't simply just about the centralisation of state power through law and order, because, in other words, the growing mechanisms of the state to secure its population from criminal behaviour were deregulated, that is to say, or were ceded to the population at large. So a great example of that, which again is borrowed from the US, is the introduction of the Neighbourhood Watch Scheme in 1982. The police force is beginning to be cut, with a cut in public services from 1981, and in its place, or as a supplement to it, was the idea that the population could police itself, that you could look out from your curtains and spot criminals in your neighbourhood and therefore report them to the police to come and watch. Another great example of that is the growth of closed-circuit television cameras, which of course has become endemic across televised population of any planet on the Earth. It's reputed to be the case that there are over 4 million closed-circuit television cameras in Britain, including speed cameras, one for every 14 people. There are over 500,000 in London alone, and it's estimated that Londoners have filmed some daily of their daily life. Don't have the time to do the respect agenda. This attempt to try and, in terms of law and order, was not also just about closed-circuit TVs and a strict the enforcement of law and order. It was also ceded to individuals to govern themselves and to make the right type of moral choices in the marketplaces. And again, there's two different elements here between Thatcher and Blair. Thatcher wants to return to Victorian family values, is always trying to promote the centrality of the heterosexual family. Measures of her administration was the use of Section 28 in 1988 to ban local education authorities from using teaching materials in schools that displayed same-sex